February 9, 1973. Abbey Road Studios, London. A band sits in silence, listening to a completed album for the first time. The final heartbeat fades. 43 minutes have passed. Nobody speaks. David Gilmour would later describe this moment as one of great joy, satisfaction, and the feeling of achievement that they'd really gone that extra mile. What they had created was an album about madness, mortality, and the crushing pressures of modern life. An album haunted by the ghost of a friend they'd lost to mental illness 5 years earlier. An album their record label initially rejected. Within 2 months, it would reach #1 in America. It would spend 937 weeks on the Billboard 200, a record that still stands today. It would sell 45 million copies worldwide, making it one of the best-selling albums in history. But here, in this moment, they simply sat in the control room and listened to the sound they'd created. A sound that would define a generation. A sound that began with a heartbeat and ended with an eclipse. This is the story of Pink Floyd's The Dark Side of the Moon. Welcome to the Sound Vault. Every album has a story, and this one changed everything. November 1971, Camden, London. The members of Pink Floyd gathered around drummer Nick Mason's kitchen table to discuss their future. They were successful by any reasonable measure. Their album Metal had been well received. They were making more money than their roadies for the first time in their careers. But something felt wrong. 4 years earlier, their founding member and creative visionary Syd Barrett had left the band under traumatic circumstances. His mental health, deteriorated by heavy LSD use and what would later be diagnosed as schizophrenia, had made it impossible for him to continue. The band had tried to cope by ignoring it. Nick Mason later admitted they had a style. Ignore it. Finally, they ignored it by not picking Syd up for a show in Southampton one day. Mason remembered the relief after Syd had gone. But Barrett's absence left a void. David Gilmour, who had replaced him on guitar, still felt like the new boy in his own band. Roger Waters, Barrett's childhood friend, had wrestled control of Pink Floyd's direction. He could be frightening, formidable, abrasive, creating the heat necessary for creativity, but also creating tension. Their recent albums, Ummagumma, Atom Heart Mother, Metal, had been commercially successful but artistically unfocused. They were known for extended instrumental jams, elaborate light shows, and cosmic soundscapes. They had become what Barrett's departure made them, a prog-rock band for college students and heads. Waters wanted something different, something more meaningful, more personal. He wanted an album that confronted major psychological and emotional concerns. He wanted to explore what made people mad. The pressures of modern life, the passage of time, greed, conflict, and death. And underneath it all, he wanted to address what they'd been unable to face. The mental illness of Syd Barrett and their guilt over watching him disappear into madness. The music world in 1971 was ready for something profound. The Beatles had disbanded. The optimism of the 1960s had curdled into the cynicism of the 1970s. Vietnam raged. Nixon was president. People were searching for meaning in an increasingly meaningless world. Pink Floyd was about to give them an album that would speak to that search. An album that acknowledged the darkness but also sought the light. January 20th, 1972. Brighton Dome, England. Pink Floyd took the stage and performed something unprecedented, an entirely new song cycle, performed live before it had been recorded in the studio. They called it Dark Side of the Moon, a piece for assorted lunatics. The show was plagued by technical problems, what Waters called severe mechanical and electric horror. But the vision was clear. This would be a concept album, every track flowing seamlessly into the next, exploring the dark side of human nature. Waters had been developing the concept for months. At rehearsals in December 1971 at the Rolling Stones' Bermondsey Warehouse, he'd shared his vision with the band. The album would explore the things that drive people mad. Conflict, greed, the passage of time, death, and mental illness. The idea wasn't entirely new. They'd explored similar territory with their 1969 concert work, The Man and the Journey. But this would be different, tighter, more focused, more accessible. Wright had requested something clean, elegant, and graphic, not their usual psychedelic noodling. Waters composed much of the material in a makeshift studio in his garden shed. The opening track, Breathe, borrowed lines from an earlier soundtrack project. Us and Them evolved from a piano piece Rick Wright had written for Michelangelo Antonioni's film Zabriskie Point, a piece the director had rejected. The band refined the material through nearly 50 live performances across Japan and the United States throughout 1972. Each night, they'd test the songs, adjust the transitions, perfect the flow. By the time they entered the studio in May 1972, they knew exactly what they wanted to create. Alan Parsons, a 23-year-old engineer who'd worked on the Beatles' Abbey Road and Let It Be, was assigned to the project. He would become crucial to translating Pink Floyd's vision into recorded reality. The vision included something revolutionary. The album would be recorded on a single continuous reel of tape. There would be no separate songs, just one 43-minute journey from birth to death, beginning and ending with a heartbeat. And hanging over everything was the specter of Syd Barrett. Waters later admitted the album was partly about Barrett's mental breakdown, though he tried to make the themes universal enough that anyone could relate. The line in Brain Damage, "And if the band you're in starts playing different tunes," directly referenced Barrett's inability to stay synchronized with the group near the end. May 31, 1972. Abbey Road Studios, Studio 3. The small studio, originally built for string quartets, had become Pink Floyd's regular home. Now it would host something extraordinary. The band had a significant advantage. Abbey Road had just installed 16-track recording capability, doubling what they'd had for previous albums. The Studer A80 16-track recorders, combined with the EMI TG12345 console, gave them unprecedented creative freedom. But even 16 tracks sometimes weren't enough. They used so many layers that they had to create second-generation copies to make more space available on the tape. Recording happened in fits and starts over 9 months. The band would work for a few days, then tour, then return. In late February, they interrupted sessions to record music for Barbet Schroeder's film La Vallée. They performed in Japan, returned to France in March, played more shows in North America. Roger Waters created the iconic opening to Money by splicing together recordings of clinking coins, cash registers, tearing paper, and a clicking counting machine into a 7-beat loop. He recorded coins swirling in his wife's pottery mixing bowl. He drilled holes in old pennies and threaded them onto strings. The loop was constructed using razor blades and splicing tape, painstaking work that took hours. The song itself was unusual, written in 7/4 time signature, giving it an unsettling, off-kilter groove that perfectly captured Waters' critique of capitalism. During the guitar solo, the time signature switched to 4/4, then back to 7/4. As Gilmour later explained, they made the poor saxophone player play in 7/4. David Gilmour worked obsessively on his guitar tones. For time, the clocks ticking at the beginning weren't decorative. They were carefully timed to create a sense of disorientation before the instruments crashed in. Rick Wright composed the piano foundation for The Great Gig in the Sky, a meditation on mortality that would become one of the album's most powerful moments. But there was a problem. The song had no vocals. They'd tried various approaches, readings from the Bible, samples of Malcolm Muggeridge's speeches, even NASA astronaut communications. Nothing worked. In January 1973, with the album nearly complete, Alan Parsons suggested Claire Torrey, a 25-year-old session singer he'd worked with before. She had tickets to see Chuck Berry but agreed to come in the next day, Sunday, January 21st. The band played her Wright's piano piece and asked her to improvise. She tried conventional vocals, "Ooh baby," but the band immediately rejected them. So she stopped thinking like a vocalist and started treating her voice like an instrument. She performed 2 complete takes, the second more emotional than the first. When Gilmour asked for a third, she stopped halfway through, feeling she was becoming repetitive. She apologized for what she thought was caterwauling, took her standard $30 session fee, and left, convinced her vocals would never make the final cut. The band was stunned by what she'd created. They pieced together the best sections from her 3 takes, and The Great Gig in the Sky became one of the most powerful vocal performances in rock history, all without a single word. Waters added another revolutionary element: interviews. He placed people in front of a microphone in darkened Studio 3 and showed them flashcards with questions ranging from favorite colors to thoughts on madness, violence, and death. Roadie Roger the Hat Manifold talked about giving someone a quick, short, sharp shock. Abbey Road doorman Jerry O'Driscoll delivered the immortal closing line: "There is no dark side of the moon, really. Matter of fact, it's all dark." Paul McCartney was among those interviewed, but Waters rejected his responses, finding them too performative and not genuine enough for what they needed. On February 9, 1973, the album was complete. The band listened to the final mix in the control room, and Gilmour felt they'd achieved something extraordinary. The creation of The Dark Side of the Moon wasn't without conflict. Roger Waters' increasingly dominant role created tension. He was the ideas man, the motivator, but also frightening and abrasive. Nick Mason, perhaps Waters' closest companion in Floyd, noted that the dynamic was akin to being in a small army unit where you oscillate easily between love and hate. Gilmour, still feeling like Barrett's replacement, struggled to assert himself creatively. Wright was more reserved, contributing musically but less vocal about direction. The band's relationship with their own past remained complicated. Barrett's departure haunted them. They'd tried to ignore his deteriorating mental health, then finally just stopped picking him up for shows. The relief Mason felt afterward was tinged with guilt that never fully disappeared. Creating an album partly about Barrett while he lived nearby in Cambridge, deteriorating further, created an emotional burden. They couldn't save him. They couldn't even help him. All they could do was channel that helplessness into music. There were practical struggles too. The quadraphonic mix proved particularly challenging. Abbey Road initially lacked some of the technology they needed, which had pushed them toward other studios for parts of Metal. By the time Dark Side sessions began, the equipment had arrived, but mastering the new technology took time. The band's record label, EMI, had initial reservations about the commercial viability of a concept album about death and madness. Previous Pink Floyd albums had confused executives with their lack of traditional packaging. Where were the words, the photos, the conventional marketing elements? And there was the simple exhaustion of constant touring while recording. Flying between continents, performing nearly 50 live versions of the material before it was even finished, maintaining the creative energy required to perfect each detail in the studio. It all took a toll. But these struggles produced something extraordinary. The friction created heat, and the heat forged something timeless. March 1, 1973. United States release. March 16, 1973. UK release. The Dark Side of the Moon entered the world with modest fanfare. It debuted at number 95 on the Billboard 200 on March 17th. Then something extraordinary happened. The album climbed and climbed. By April 28, 1973, it reached number 1, Pink Floyd's first chart-topping album. Money became a surprise hit single, reaching number 13 on the Billboard Hot 100, driven by both FM and AM radio play. The press reception was mostly enthusiastic, though not unanimous. At the February 27th press event at the London Planetarium, the band, minus Wright, had boycotted because the quadraphonic mix wasn't complete. Instead, journalists were greeted by life-sized cardboard cutouts of the band members, while the stereo mix played over a poor-quality PA system. Melody makers Roy Hollingworth found Side 1 utterly confused but praised Side 2. Steve Peacock of Sounds wrote that he'd unreservedly recommend the album to everyone, even those who'd never heard Pink Floyd before. Rolling Stone's Lloyd Grossman declared it a fine album with textural and conceptual richness that invited and demanded involvement. But the album's true impact wasn't immediately apparent in reviews. It was in the sales figures, the chart positions, the word of mouth spreading across college campuses and record stores. Capitol Records in the US had launched a massive promotional campaign, Sensing they had something special, the iconic Prism cover, designed by Storm Thorgerson, and Hypnosis, with artwork by George Hardy, became instantly recognizable. Thorgerson had seen an illustration of light refraction through a prism in a physics textbook and realized it perfectly captured both Pink Floyd's legendary light shows and the themes of Waters' lyrics, thought, ambition, and the dispersion of unity into chaos. The album included 2 posters and stickers. The band took a cut in their royalty rate so these could be included without raising the price. As Thorgerson said, "This was in the days when packaging really meant something. It was a present to the fans." The album didn't leave the charts. Week after week, month after month, year after year, it remained. New fans discovered it. Old fans bought it again on different formats. It became a rite of passage. The album you had to own, had to understand, had to experience. By any measure, The Dark Side of the Moon redefined what was possible in popular music. It spent 937 weeks on the Billboard 200, 18 years. The next closest competitor, Bob Marley's Legend, managed only 513 weeks. After the catalog chart was created in 1991, the album added another 1,001 weeks there. The album has sold approximately 45 million copies worldwide, making it one of the 5 best-selling albums in history. In the United States alone, it's been certified 15 times platinum. But the impact went beyond sales figures. The album proved that concept albums about death and mental illness could achieve massive commercial success. It showed that progressive rock could be accessible without being simplistic. It demonstrated that albums could be artistically ambitious and still connect with millions of people. The production techniques Parsons and Pink Floyd pioneered influenced countless artists. The seamless transitions between tracks, the use of non-musical sounds as instruments, the careful attention to stereo and quadraphonic space. These became benchmarks for ambitious musicians everywhere. The album's themes resonated across generations. In 1973, it spoke to Vietnam-era anxiety. In the 1980s, it addressed Reagan-era materialism. In the 1990s and 2000s, new generations discovered its meditation on time, mortality, and mental health. Even in 2025, the themes remain relevant, perhaps more so than ever. Artists from Radiohead to U2 to the Flaming Lips have cited the album's influence. Hip-hop producers have sampled it. Indie bands have covered it. In 2012, Rolling Stone readers ranked Claire Torry's performance on The Great Gig in the Sky as the second-best vocal performance in rock history, behind only Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody. The album made Pink Floyd wealthy beyond imagination. It also made them prisoners of their own success in some ways. Waters later grew to resent the massive audiences their popularity attracted, feeling they'd become the very thing the album critiqued. But for millions of fans, the album provided something profound, a soundtrack for confronting life's biggest questions. The passage of time, the meaning of mortality, the fragility of sanity, the corrupting influence of greed. For an album celebrated for its artistry, The Dark Side of the Moon generated its share of controversies. The biggest emerged in 2004, more than 30 years after the album's release. Claire Torry, who had received only $30 for her session work on The Great Gig in the Sky, sued Pink Floyd and EMI for songwriting royalties. She argued that her improvised vocal performance constituted co-authorship of the track. In 2005, an out-of-court settlement was reached in Torry's favor, though the terms were never disclosed. All pressings after 2005 credit the composition to both Richard Wright and Claire Torry. Experts speculated the settlement could have been worth hundreds of thousands of pounds. The case raised important questions about session musicians' rights and the nature of creative contribution. Torry had improvised everything. No one had given her a melody, lyrics, or direction beyond the album's theme. Was that composition? The court said yes. Some fans and critics felt Torry deserved the recognition and payment. Others argued that session work is session work, and improvising over someone else's chord progression doesn't constitute songwriting. The debate continues. There were other, smaller controversies. The album's cover art contained only 6 colors in the light spectrum instead of the traditional 7. Indigo was omitted. Some saw symbolic meaning, others saw a design choice. Urban legends proliferated. The most famous claimed the album synchronized perfectly with The Wizard of Oz, a claim the band members have consistently denied as coincidental nonsense. The album's massive commercial success created internal tensions. Waters increasingly felt the band had become too popular, attracting audiences who didn't understand or care about the music's deeper meanings. This resentment would eventually contribute to his departure from Pink Floyd in the 1980s. There was also the uncomfortable reality that the band had profited immensely from an album about the corrupting nature of money. Waters acknowledged this irony in a 1993 interview, admitting he'd had to decide whether he was really a socialist or had become a capitalist. He became a capitalist, though he remained keen on a general welfare society. The album's exploration of mental illness, inspired by Barrett's tragedy, felt exploitative to some observers. Had Pink Floyd used their friends' suffering to create art and make millions? The band members have always maintained the album was about universal themes, not specifically about Barrett, but the specter of his breakdown undeniably influenced the work. 52 years after its release, The Dark Side of the Moon remains a cultural touchstone. The album has been reissued multiple times, 20th anniversary editions, 30th anniversary SACD versions with new surround sound mixes, 50th anniversary deluxe box sets. Each release sells hundreds of thousands of copies. In 2012, the Library of Congress selected the album for preservation in the National Recording Registry for being culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant. The prism cover has transcended its original purpose, becoming a symbol of Pink Floyd itself, appearing on t-shirts, posters, and dorm room walls worldwide. People who've never heard the album recognize the image. The album continues to sell approximately 8,500 copies weekly, often outpacing current releases on the lower end of the Billboard 200. It remains the 4th longest charting album of all time in the UK and the highest selling album never to reach #1 there. Musicians continue to pay homage. Fish covered the entire album in 1998. Dream Theater performed it twice in concert. Easy Star All-Stars released a reggae version called Dub Side of the Moon. The album's influence extends beyond music. Psychologists study its exploration of mental health themes. Physicists reference the prism imagery. Philosophers analyze Waters' lyrics about the human condition. For many listeners, The Dark Side of the Moon remains a deeply personal experience. People play it during difficult times, finding solace in its acknowledgement of life's struggles. They play it to remember lost loved ones. They play it to contemplate their own mortality. The album's meditation on time, particularly in the song Time, with its lyrics about wasting years and suddenly realizing 10 years have got behind you, resonates with every generation that discovers it. The anxiety about aging, about potential unfulfilled, about life passing too quickly. These fears are universal and timeless. Alan Parsons, who engineered the album, called it the best studio experience he ever had. Waters described it as an expression of political, philosophical, humanitarian empathy. Gilmour reflected that it's an album you have to listen to all the way through, not as individual songs but as a complete statement. And that might be the album's greatest legacy. It insisted that popular music could be experienced as art, as a complete work meant to be absorbed in its entirety, demanding engagement and reflection from the listener. The Dark Side of the Moon is the story of transformation. A band transformed by the loss of their founding member, channeling that trauma into art. A genre transformed as progressive rock found mainstream acceptance. A generation transformed, discovering that popular music could explore life's deepest questions. At its heart, the album is about confronting darkness, in society, in ourselves, in the people we love. It acknowledges that madness, greed, time, conflict, and death are inescapable parts of human existence. But it doesn't offer easy answers or false hope. Instead, it offers something more valuable. Recognition. The validation that comes from knowing others share your fears, your anxieties, your sense that modern life is overwhelming and that sanity is more fragile than we'd like to admit. Roger Waters wanted to create an album about the things that make people mad. He succeeded, but he also created an album that made people feel less alone in their madness. Syd Barrett, whose mental breakdown inspired much of the album, lived until 2006. He spent his final decades in Cambridge, away from music, away from fame, away from Pink Floyd. The band members would occasionally see him around town, but he wanted no contact. He disappeared into the dark side that Waters wrote about. The album that emerged from his tragedy outlived him. It continues to comfort, challenge, and inspire millions. Students discovering it for the first time experience the same revelation their grandparents did in 1973, that someone understands. That 8-month recording process at Abbey Road, those 937 weeks on the charts, those 45 million albums sold, they all come back to a simple truth. Great art emerges from confronting what we'd rather ignore. Pink Floyd looked at Syd Barrett's madness, at their own guilt and fear, at society's greed and violence, at humanity's mortality, and they didn't look away. They created something beautiful from something painful. And that heartbeat, the one that opens and closes the album, representing the journey from birth to death, still beats. Still reminds us that we're alive, we're fragile, we're temporary. But while we're here, we can listen, we can reflect, we can recognize the darkness and seek the light. This has been the Sound Vault. Every album has a story, and The Dark Side of the Moon is a story that, like that prism on the cover, takes the white light of human experience and reveals all its hidden colors. The beautiful and the terrible, the joyful and the tragic, the light and the dark. Some albums entertain, some albums inspire. This album does something rarer. It understands, and understanding, after all, might be the greatest gift music can give.